All right, so I will now turn it over to Dylan to go through the side-by sheets with the differences between the House and the Senate on House Bill 2007. Dylan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Dylan Deere. I am the Assistant Director for Fiscal Affairs. I'm going to make some general comments as everyone collects the conference comparison reports about what you're going to see inside of here. I wanted to give you a kind of a sort of an overview and make some general comments. So some of the Senate positions will look different from the Senate shorthand because the Senate shorthand was differences from the House. But when we put this together, all Senate positions are differences from House Bill 2007 as introduced. All right. That way you can see the full fiscal effect of each one of the changes. An example of that is on page 24 with the SGF lapse for operating expenditures. The House is at 1.5%. The Senate is at 3% operating expenditure reduction. And so you see the $35 million effect in the House and the $70 million effect in the Senate. So you see the full effect. And you'll see that over and over again so that when both the House and the Senate took actions on the same item, you see the full effect in either the House or the Senate positions. Also, SB 125. The House has passed SB 125, the trailer bill. That includes claims, funding for human services caseloads, and some GBAs. Where the Senate has already adopted the SB 125 position, okay, in the House column, it'll just say SB 125. This is not pulling new things onto the conference list that would not have already been there. These would have all been House Bill 2007 differences. We're just letting you know, hey, that does exist in another bill. Okay, in situations in which an item is only in SB 125 but not in the Senate, that is not on that is not inside of this conference committee report. We do have a list which we could share with you if you just ask for it. We have a list of those items. So talking about major changes that you see in here from a statewide perspective, SGF operating expenditures are the biggest percent versus 3%. The Senate, the Budget Stabilization Fund is capped at $1.75 billion, and interest is transferred to the State General Fund. The Senate has some positions on lapses from the Department of Administration and the Office of the Governor for DEI elimination. There's a return to office mandate that's in the conference list. And also there's some decisions on vacant position funding, whether you take that at the beginning of FY26 or the end of FY26. Inside of general government, you have the treatment of EDIF funds. Obviously, the Senate position is to delete the majority of those grants. The House has specific positions on that. There's $50 million from the Build Kansas Fund to create a new Kansas aviation jobs loan program. Inside of human services, there is a $50 million, including $20 million SGF increase for hospital outpatient rates. There's also funding of the Gamewell contract increase. Inside of education, there's a Senate position that takes it largely back with the intent of funding only Gannon items. And also the question around special education. And in public safety, there's the questions of Troop C headquarters at $55 million from the State Highway Fund and the KBI headquarters at $100 million in bonding authority only. So that's just some major items. And with that, unless anyone has any questions, I'll go ahead and start the read through. Megan and Stephen, as we have done in the last couple of years, will assist in that process.
Are there any questions? All right, seeing none, you may proceed.
All right, starting on page 1 with the Attorney General in FY 2025, there's Vine system funding. Add $248,322 SGF for the Victim Identification Notification System in FY 2025. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Item 2, Safe and Secure Firearm Detection. Add $7 million SGF to the Safe and Secure Firearm Detection Program account, and add language that the Office of the Attorney General hire a private vendor for firearm detection software. The House added the funding. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding or the language. In 26, you have Safe and Secure Firearm Detection again at $7 million. The House added the funding and the language. The Senate did not. And in 27, you have Safe and Secure Firearm Detection at $6 million. The House added the funding and the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding or the language. Going to bids in 25, reappropriations lapses, add funding for previously lapsed reappropriations from the state general for general operating expenditures in 25. The House added $1 million SGF for a total lapse of 6. The Senate added $2.4 million SGF for a total lapse of 4.6. Inside of D of A, items 1 and 2, the House added language to change the name to the Robert J. Dole State Office Building. The Senate did not recommend that. Moving to page 2.
Page 2, starting with item 2, ERP modernization. The House added $26 million, all from the ARPA State Relief Fund, to begin conversion to a cloud-based enterprise resourcing planning system. The Senate did not recommend adding that position. Item 3, State House office space. The Senate recommended adding language requiring the agency to charge and collect rental payments from non-state entities. Within the State House did not recommend adding the language. Moving on to fiscal year 27, item 1 is the Docking State Office Building, renaming to the Robert J. Dole State Office Building. The House recommended adding the language. The Senate did not. Moving on to the Department of Commerce for fiscal year 26, item 1, MRO. The Senate recommended adding $15.5 million SGF for a loan for maintenance, repair, and overhaul of airplanes at the Topeka Regional Airport for 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 2, E-Aviation Grant. The Senate recommended adding $4 million, all from ARP interest, as well as language to transfer funds for fiscal year 26. This would be for a grant for airports, for technology, tower upgrades, vertiport, heliport, and office space to attract E-Aviation unmanned aircraft systems. Item number 3, the rural remote workplace. The House recommended adding $1.5 million, all from ARPA interest, for rural remote workplaces for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Item 4, KC BioHub. The House recommended adding $1 million, all from ARPA interest, for KC BioHub for 26, as well as language authorizing the funding can only be distributed upon receipt of a federal grant. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding or the language. Item number 5, the semi-sesquicentennial. The House recommended adding $73,000, all from ARPA interest, to continue preparations for the semi-sesquicentennial, including 1 FTE position for 26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 6 is the Sunflower Summer Program. Both House and Senate recommended deleting EDIF for the program. The House recommended deleting $2.5 million, whereas the Senate recommended deleting only $500,000.
On page 3, continuing with the Department of Commerce. Also for the Sunflower Summer Program, the Senate recommended adding language to prohibit reimbursements for venues that do not charge an admission fee to program participants. Number 8, small business R&D. The House recommended deleting $500,000 EDIF for small business research and development. The Senate recommended a deletion of $1 million. Number 9, public broadcasting. The House recommended deleting $200,000 EDIF for public broadcasting grants. The Senate recommended deleting $700,000. The House recommended deleting $35,977 EDIF for strong military bases program for fiscal year 26. The Senate recommended deleting $250,000. For Build Up Kansas, the Senate recommended deleting $2 million EDIF for Build Up Kansas. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. For HEAL grants, the Senate recommended deleting $1.5 million EDIF for HEAL grants within the Office of Rural Prosperity. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The House adjusted the funding source for the Office of Broadband Development. This is an amount of $1.1 million. The House recommended adjusting the source to use federal funding, and the Senate did not recommend adjusting the source and to use EDIF funding. The Senate recommended deleting $1.0 million EDIF for the Office of Registered Apprenticeships for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate recommended deleting $1 million EDIF for the Kansas Arts Commission in fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting that funding. The Senate recommended deleting $1 million EDIF for rural opportunity zones. The House did not recommend deleting that funding. The Senate recommended deleting $850 EDIF for the Main Street program. The House did not recommend deleting that funding. The Senate recommended deleting $714,000 EDIF for work-based learning for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting that funding.
Starting on page 4. Quality Places, delete $670,000 EDIF for Quality Places. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Older Kansas Employment Program, delete $504,000 EDIF for Older Kansas Employment Program. House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Delete $204,500 EDIF for the Governor's Economic Council for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Delete $150,000 EDIF for Rural Champions for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Delete $99,000 EDIF for My Reemployment Program for 2026. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. delete $8,400 EDIF for the Senior Community Service Employment Program for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Add $249,069 EDIF for the operating grant for 26 and add language to review all EDIF expenditures and transfers at conference. The House did not recommend adding the funding or the language. The Senate added the funding and the language. Add $300,000 EDIF for junior achievement. The House added the funding. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Add $445,227 EDIF for the international division. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Add $920,398 EDIF for the tourism division. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Delete $2.6 million all from the Job Creation Program Fund for 26 and add $2.6 million for JCPF for Build Up Kansas for 2026. The House did not recommend adding or deleting the funding. The Senate added and deleted the funding.
Moving on to page 5, item 30, the Rural Opportunity Zones Program Fund. The Senate recommended deleting $6 million from the Job Creation Program Fund for 26, as well as to add $3 million for the Rural Opportunity Zones Program Fund for 26 and 27. The Senate also recommended adding language stating the agency must only use the funds for student loan repayments and Rural Opportunity Zone tax credits. The House did not recommend adding the funding, deleting the funding, or adding the language. Moving on to the judicial branch, item number 1, the House recommended deleting $500,000 SGF in operating expenditures for volunteer firefighter relief for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend deleting the funding. Item number 2, the mental health justice grant. The Senate recommended appropriating a federal grant fund related to addressing mental health disorders that lead to criminal offenses for 26. The House did not recommend adding the fund. Moving on to the Kansas Lottery, fiscal year 25, item 1, sports wagering negotiations. The Senate recommended adding language providing the agency shall not expend monies to negotiate or enter into any contract extension or renewals of an existing contract for the management of sports wagering with any lottery and gaming facility manager in 25. The House included that item in SB 125. Moving on to 26, item 1 is that same item just for 26. Moving on to the Office of the Governor, item number 1, travel. The Senate recommended adding language directing the executive branch to disclose any travel by the governor or lieutenant governor that is reimbursed by the state for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding the language. Moving on to Secretary of State's. This is, item number 1 is regulation modernization. This is an addition of $1.5 million to modernize the state regulation making process by implementing an electronic regulation system in 25. The House recommended adding the funding from the Technology Communication Fee Fund, whereas the Senate recommended adding the funding from ARPA interest.
On page 6, the state treasurer for fiscal year 26. The Senate recommended appropriating a Star Bonds food sales tax revenue replacement fund and adding language that provides cities with a population of 30,000 or less within an established Star Bond district to receive funding for the amount of additional sales and use tax revenue that would have been realized from sales of food and food ingredients for the months of January 2024 through June 2025 if the state rate for state sales tax had been 6.5%. The House did not recommend appropriating the fund or adding the language. The House recommended adding $2 million SGF for the Pregnancy Compassion Awareness Program for fiscal year 26. The Senate recommended adding $6 million for this purpose. The Senate recommended adding $1.5 million EDIF for the Talent Grant Fund and language to use the SGF if EDIF is not available for fiscal year 26. The House included this same position in Senate Bill 125. The House recommended adding language to utilize $19.3 million for the Housing Linked Deposit Loan Program for infrastructure projects for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend adding the language. The Senate recommending deleting $50 million all from special revenue funds from the Build Kansas program and adding $50 million all from special revenue funds to provide loans to an airport authority or an entity engaged in the business of maintenance, repair, and overhaul of aircrafts for fiscal year 26. Also recommended adding language that the state treasurer would enter into loan agreements with fixed interest rates, repayment provisions, and other terms and conditions that would minimize the impact on state revenue. They also recommended adding language that requires a personal guarantee for these loans. The House did not recommend adjusting the funds or adding the language. Starting in Human Services at the bottom of page 6, the Department for Aging and Disability Services. The House has recommended adding $1 million to offset a federal cut to senior nutrition funding. The Senate recommended adding $3 million. The House recommended adding $6 million SGF for one-time grants to community mental health centers. The Senate did not recommend adding this funding.
Going to page 7, homeless shelter renovation. Add $830,000 SGF in one-time funding and add language directing the agency to expend the funds to renovate a homeless shelter. The House added the funding and the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding or the language. Brain injury waiver rates. Add funding to raise rates for 5 services on the BI waiver for 26. House position, add $1 million, including $415,000 SGF to raise the rates to $20 per unit. Senate position, add $11.3 million, including $4.5 million to raise the rates to $30 per unit. IDD waiver slots, add funding to add slots to the IDD waiver for FY 2026. House position, add $22.4 million, including $8.7 million SGF to add 320. Senate, add $35 million, including $13.6 million SGF to add 500. Substance abuse disorder treatment, add $4 million SGF to supplement federal block grant funding to provide substance abuse disorder treatment for FY 26. The increase is offset by the deletion of $4 million SGF for certified community behavioral health clinic planning grants in 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Item 7, long-term care resource guide, add $190,000 SGF to develop a comprehensive statewide long-term care resource guide available in both digital and print. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Item 8, adolescent SUD rates, add $1.2 million, including $482,000 SGF, and add language directing the agency to increase the Medicaid rate for substance abuse disorder treatment for adolescents from $206 to $375 per day for 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding or the language. The Senate added the funding and the language. Item 9, IDD waiver reimbursement rates, add $21.3 million, including $8.5 million SGF to increase reimbursement rates for IDD waiver services for 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Item 10, CCBHC planning grants, delete $4 million SGF for certified community behavioral health clinic planning grants for FY 26. The funding was approved by the 2024 Legislature and was deleted to fund $4 million in substance abuse disorder grants. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Item 11, IDD waitlist cap. Add language to cap the number of individuals on the IDD waitlist for FY 2026. The House capped it at 4,000. The Senate capped it at 3,800. Lottery ticket vending machine transfer, add language to adjust the statutory cap for the lottery ticket vending machine transfer for 26. The House increased the cap to $12 million at a rate of $1 million per month. The Senate increased the cap to $9 million at a rate of $750,000 per month.
Moving on to DCF on page 8. Item number 1 under fiscal year 26, both House and Senate recommended deleting funding from this Children's Initiatives Fund for Workforce Registry for Child Care for fiscal year 26. The House recommended deleting $1.1 million, whereas the Senate recommended deleting just $1 million. Item number 2, the House recommended, this is software licenses, the House recommended adding $883,200, including about $380,000 from interest from the ARPA State Relief Fund for 26 to purchase 800 licenses for client management software. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 3, Spark Wheel. The Senate recommended adding language to appropriate the Spark Wheel program as a no-limit special revenue fund for 26, as well as to add language to transfer $50,000 from the Family and Children Trust account of the Family and Children Investment Fund within the Kansas State Department of Education to the Spark Wheel program within DCF for 26. The House did not recommend adding the language. Item number 4 is the summer EBT fraud reimbursement. Both House and Senate recommended adding SGF to reimburse benefits lost to skimming for the summer EBT program. The House recommended adding $100,000 SGF, whereas the Senate recommended adding $10,000 from the SGF. Item number 5 is summer EBT. The Senate recommended adding language that summer EBT can only be used for purchases made in Kansas for 26. The House did not recommend adding the language. Moving on to the Department of Labor, the Senate recommended adding language to update the definition of temporarily unemployed to include individuals covered by a collective bargaining agreement that have been laid off from full-time work and reasonably expect to resume full-time work within 6 months. The House did not recommend adding the language. Item number 2 is the Sheltered Workshop Transition Grant Program. The Senate recommended deleting $1 million from the Kansas Sheltered Workshop Transition Fund, and as well as to delete the transfer of $1 million from EDIF to that fund in 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding or the transfer. Moving on to KDHE Health, item number 1 is the Gainwell contract increase. The Senate recommended adding $16.2 million, including $4.8 million SGF for the agency's contract with Gainwell Technologies for fiscal year 25. The House did not recommend adding the funding.
On page 9 at the top, the Senate recommended adding $2.5 million SGF to restore the reappropriation for the Child Care Pilot Program. This is the state partnership with Blue Cross Blue Shield. The House did not recommend adding this funding. The Senate recommended adding language to no longer continuously to no longer provide continuous eligibility for Medicaid for the parent and caregiver population for fiscal year '25. The House did not recommend adding this language. The House added language requiring the agency to adhere to the MCO contracts as originally agreed upon for fiscal year '26, fiscal year '25, and the Senate did not recommend adding that language. The House recommended adding back 30 FTE positions that are funded entirely with federal funds. The Senate did not recommend adding the FTE positions. In fiscal year '26, the Senate recommended adding $50 million, including $20 million SGF, to increase hospital outpatient rates for fiscal year '26. The House did not recommend this funding. The Senate recommending adding $16.7 million. That includes $5 million SGF for the agency's contract with Gainwell Technologies. The Senate recommended adding $1 million SGF for rural community health centers with primary family medicine resident educational sites. The House did not recommend adding this funding. The Senate recommended adding $96,000 SGF for the funding for the control and prevention of tuberculosis. For fiscal year '26, the House recommended adding $1.5 million SGF in Senate Bill 125. The House recommended adding $1 million, all from ARPA interest, for a healthcare upskilling training program for fiscal year '26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate recommended adding language to no longer provide continuous eligibility for Medicaid for the parent and caregiver population, also for fiscal year '26. The House did not recommend this language. The House added language to require the agency to adhere to the MCO contracts as originally agreed upon for fiscal year '26. The Senate did not recommend adding this language.
Page 10. Item A, CanCare 3.0 Interim Committee. Add language to create an interim study committee to examine CanCare 3.0, including but not limited to the requirements, actions, and rules of the agencies administering the program, the execution of the program, and the actuarial and financial concerns and practices for '26. The House did not recommend adding the language. The Senate added the language. Add 30 FTE positions that are funded entirely with federal funds. The House added the FTE positions. The Senate did not add the FTE positions. Lawrence State Hospital, FY25, Item 1, agency nursing staff. Add funding for contract nursing. The House added $30 million. The Senate added $20 million. Agency nursing staff for '26, add $10 million. The House did not add the funding. The Senate added the funding. Osawatomie State Hospital, Item 1, agency nursing staff, add $8 million to fund a budget shortfall of contract nursing staff. The House added the funding. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Board of Regents, Item 1, reappropriations lapse, add $1.9 million SGF for computer science pre-service educator grant program. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Reappropriations lapse, state scholarship program, add $1.2 million SGF for the state scholarship program in '25. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Reappropriations lapse, nurse educator grant. Add $485,683 SGF for the nurse educator grant program in FY25. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Reappropriations lapse, nursing student scholarship. Add $405,895 SGF for the nursing student scholarship in FY25. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding.
Moving on to page 11, item number 5. This is the EDIF reappropriation lapse. The Senate recommended adding $40,594 from the EDIF for the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. The House did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 6, EDIF reappropriation lapse, tech innovation. The Senate recommended adding about $27,000 from the EDIF for technology and innovation internship programs. The House did not recommend adding the funding. Moving on to fiscal year '26. For items 1 through 7, the Senate position is exactly the same as the House position, just minus $1 from the SGF. So I'm just going to read through these items. Item number 1 is the 2-year college apprenticeship program. This is the addition of SGF for 2-year college apprenticeship account, as well as language to allocate the funding and designated schools for '26. Item number 2 is the community college capital outlay for 2-year colleges. This is the addition of SGF for CTE capital outlay aid, as well as the addition of language to allocate funds to those designated schools, $5 million and about $4.9 million for the Senate position. Item number 3 is tier technical education. This is a little under $4 million from the SGF. This is addition of SGF for tier technical education, as well as language allocating funding to designated schools. Item 4, non-tier technical education. This is a deletion of a little over $800,000 of SGF from the non-tier technical education account, as well as language allocating funding to those designated schools. Item number 5 is tuition for technical education. This is about $3.9 million from the SGF for tuition technical education, as well as language allocating funding for those designated schools. Item number 6 is technical colleges operating grants for 2-year colleges, about $7 million from the SGF to technical colleges operating grants for 26. Item number 7 is the 2-year college student success initiative. This is about $10.5 million from the SGF for 2-year colleges student success initiatives for 26. Item number 8, both House and Senate recommended adjusting funding for the Kansas Campus Restoration Fund account for fiscal year 26. The House recommended deleting the transfer of $32.7 million SGF, whereas the Senate recommended adding $32.7 million, including $13.2 million transferred from Apex funds, as well as the addition of $19.5 million transferred from ARPA interest funds. Item number 9, the Senate recommended adding $21 million SGF for regional growth and development initiatives in 26, whereas the House did not recommend adding the funding.
On page 12, number 10, the Senate recommended deleting $1.8 million SGF from the Student Aid for Financial Need account for Washburn University. Number 11, the Senate recommended deleting $2.5 million SEDIF and adding $2.5 million SGF to adjust the funding source and add language allocating funding to the designated schools for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adjusting the funding source or adding the language. The Senate recommended deleting $993,000 SEDIF and adding the same amount SGF to adjust the funding source for the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. The House did not recommend adjusting the funding source. The House recommended adding $2 million, all from ARPA interest, for the Kansas Blueprint for Literacy for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend adding that funding. The House recommended deleting $1 million SGF for the Computer Science Pre-Service Educator Grant for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend deleting the funding. The House recommended deleting $114,000 to lapse funding for the Career Technical Workforce Grant for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate recommended adding language authorizing the transfer of $1 million from the SGF to the Adult Learner Grant Fund for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding this language. The Senate recommended adding reappropriation language for fiscal year 25 university line item enhancements to reappropriate into fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding this language. The Senate recommended adding specified no-limit funds and deferred maintenance accounts to each state educational institution section of the bill, so each institution may receive federal funding and funds for the Campus Restoration Act for fiscal year 26. The House recommended this position in Senate Bill 125. The Senate recommended adding $8,000 SGF to the operating account for the 27th payroll adjustment from the Department of Administration. The House did not recommend adding this funding.
Moving to page 13. Department of Education, FY25, Safe and Secure Schools, delete $5 million SGF for Safe and Secure School grants. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Professional Development, delete $1.8 million SGF for Professional Development Program in FY25. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. CTE Transportation, delete $1.5 million SGF for CTE Transportation for State Aid in FY25. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Delete $1.3 million SGF from the Mentor Teacher Program in FY25. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Computer Science Advancement Grants, delete $1 million SGF for Computer Science Advancement Grants, or PAC grants, in FY25. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Teacher Excellence, delete $360,693 SGF for Teacher Excellence in FY 2025. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Spark Wheel, delete $50,000 all in special revenue funds for Spark Wheel in 25. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Going to 26. There's a CIF section. Add language to change the bill section titled Children's Cabinet to Children's Initiatives Fund and clarify that specific funds be appropriated for use by DCF, KDHE, or KSDE using CIF monies. Also, move transfer language back to the original agency's budget sections for FY26. This does not change the amounts appropriated within those funds and transfers. House position did not recommend adjusting the language. Senate adjusted the language. Add $10 million SGF for special education state aid for FY26. The House added the funding. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Child Care Accelerator grants add $2 million, all from ARPA interest for a public-private partnership under the purview of the Children's Cabinet for Child Care Facility Operations in southwestern Kansas for FY2026. The House added the funding. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding.
Moving on to page 14, item number 4, the Senate recommended adding $1.8 million SGF as well as language directing the agency to provide a matching funds grant with a charitable organization to provide toiletry kits for public schools for 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding or the language. Item number 5, both House and Senate recommended adding funding for the E-rate program state match for 26. The House recommended adding appropriating $500,000 from the SGF, whereas the Senate recommended adding language directing the agency to use no less than $500,000 from existing funds to provide the state match for the program. Item number 6, the Senate recommended adding language directing the agency to expend $2 million, all from existing resources, and to issue an RFP for a supplemental American history online curriculum, and to add language requiring a yearly report to the Senate Ways and Means and House Appropriations Committees. The House did not recommend adding the language. Item number 7 is language regarding teacher training. The Senate recommended adding language encouraging expenditures from existing funds to be used to expand current efforts to train both elementary and middle school teachers in the area of science or reading, including assisting students to reach grade level literacy for 26. The House did not recommend adding the language. Item number 8, safe and secure schools. Both House and Senate recommended deleting funding for safe and secure grants for fiscal year 26. The House recommended deleting $5 million SGF, whereas the Senate recommended deleting $3.5 million SGF and adding language requiring that at least $250,000 be used for the instruction in CPR and AED use in public schools, at least $1 million to be used to purchase the AEDs, and maintenance equipment for school districts, at least $125,000 to be used for instruction in CPR and AED use in non-public schools, and $125,000 to be used to purchase AEDs and maintenance equipment in non-public schools. Item number 9, the Senate recommended deleting $1.8 million SGF for professional development program in 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. Item number 10, CTE transportation. The Senate recommended deleting $1.5 million SGF for CTE transportation state aid for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. Item number 11, mentor teachers program. Item number the Senate recommended deleting $1.3 million SGF for the mentor teacher program for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. Item number 12, the computer science advancements grants. The Senate recommended deleting $1 million SGF for computer science advancement grants, PAC grants for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding.
On page 15, the Senate recommended deleting $360,000 SGF for teacher excellence for fiscal year 26. At number 14, the Senate recommended deleting $50,000 on special revenue funds for Spark Wheel for fiscal year 26. This funding was moved to DCF. The House did not recommend deleting that funding. The House recommended adding $10 million SGF for special education state aid for fiscal year 27. This $10 million is maintenance of effort only, not an additional increase from fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend adding that funding. Emporia State University, fiscal year 26. The Senate recommended deleting $1.2 million SGF from the Student Aid for Financial Need account for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate recommended, Fort Hays State University, fiscal year 26. The Senate recommended deleting $3.5 million SGF from the Student Aid for Financial Need account for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. For Kansas State University, fiscal year 26, the Senate recommended deleting $3.9 million SGF from the Student Aid for Financial Need account. The House did not recommend deleting this funding. The Senate recommended adding language authorizing bonding authority of $23.5 million for capital improvement projects related to animal science, agronomy research, global gain for grain, and Collin Weber Hall for fiscal year 26. This item is included in the Senate Bill 125 as a House position. The Senate recommended deleting $336,000 EDIF from the KSU Ag Experiment Station for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting this funding. The Senate recommended adding $1 million SGF for wildfire suppression for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding.
Going to page 16. So EDIF KSU 105, add $3.5 million to EDIF for the Cooperative Extension Operating Account for KSU 105, and add language to prohibit the transfer of SGF from the KSU ESARP to KSU main campus through the responsibility-centered budget model for FY26. The House added the funding and the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding or the language. KSU 105 Resource Center language. Add language that the agency shall develop an easily accessible and visible one-step resource center for entrepreneurs and small businesses, which will act as a conduit for local and state resources throughout our 105 counties for FY26. The House added the language. The Senate did not add the language. KSU 105 goals language. Add language that the agency shall identify priority industry-specific goals to reduce workforce gaps in the Kansas economy relating to a growing need for skilled workforce and target business startups and development that fits those needs through implementation of small business loans for 26. The House added the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the language. Add language the agency shall provide evidence that the outlined goals have been met, along with the number of jobs, including job classification, are created and retained through direct assistance from K-State 105 for 26. The House added the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the language. KSU 105 report language. Add language that the agency shall provide technical assistance to partners in the state throughout the K-State Extension Network and report to the Legislature enumerating those specific programs and assistance which contributed to job creation and retention for 26. The House added the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the language. Pitt State 26, student financial aid, delete $1.8 million SGF from the student aid for financial need account for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. School for the Blind FY25 SGF reappropriations request, add $41,738 SGF for the extended school year program in 25 to recover funds that lapsed in 24. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. 26 SGF reappropriation request, add reappropriation language for the extended school year program SGF account for 26. The House did not recommend adding the language. The Senate added the language.
Moving on to page 17, the School for the Deaf. Fiscal year 26, item 1, the Senate recommended deleting $300,000, all from the Job Creation Program Fund for 26, as well as to add $300,000 from the Job Creation Program Fund for Classroom Resource Teacher Fund for 26. The House did not recommend adding the language. State Library, fiscal year 26, item 1, the House recommended deleting $486,000 from the SGF, as well as to delete language in HB 2007 regarding a base amount of $1,000 to each eligible library and the base amount for each regional library system for 26. The Senate did not recommend deleting the funding or the language. Moving on to the University of Kansas for fiscal year 25, item 1, the House recommended adding about $760,000, all from ARPA interest for airborne electromagnetic surveys for the Kansas Geological Survey for 25. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. For fiscal year 26, item 1, the Senate recommended deleting $4.1 million from the SGF for student aid for financial need account for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. Item number 2 is the Housing Bonding Authority. The Senate recommended adding language authorizing bonding authority of $100 million for housing for 26. The House included that item in SB 125. Item number 3, the Central District Bonding Authority. The Senate recommended adding language allowing the agency to refinance bonds of up to $276 million for the Central District for 26. The House included that item in SB 125. Moving on to fiscal year 27, item 1 is the Housing Bonding Authority item that we saw in 26. The Senate recommended adding language authorizing that bonding authority of up to $100 million for 27. The House included that item in SB 125. And item number 2, Central District Bonding Authority, the same item as in 26. The Senate recommended adding the language, whereas the House included that language in SB 125.
On page 18, fiscal year 26 for the University of Kansas Medical Center, the Senate recommended deleting $1.1 million SGF from the Student Aid for Financial Need account for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. There was a recommendation to add SGF for aviation research. The House recommended adding $4.5 million. The Senate recommended adding $5 million. The Senate recommended deleting $4.2 million SGF from the Student Aid for Financial Need account for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting this funding. The Senate recommended adding $750,000 SGF for a feasibility study for a dental school in partnership with Fort Hays State University for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate recommended adding language authorizing bonding authority in the amount of $60 million for the WSU University Stadium project for fiscal year 26. The House included this in Senate Bill 125. The Senate also added language for the same bonding authority for Wichita State University Stadium project in fiscal year '27. And again, this item was included by the House in Senate Bill 125. Public safety for the Adjutant General in fiscal year 2025. The Senate recommended adding $13.6 million, including $1.6 million SGF for the reimbursement payments related to state disaster events in fiscal year '25. The House did not recommend adding this funding. The Senate recommended adding $400,000 SGF for planning, training, exercises, disaster response, and recovery activities to compensate Kansas Division of Emergency Management for federal grant reductions in fiscal year '25, and the House did not recommend adding that funding.
I turn to page 19. FY26 KDEM federal cut, add $500,000 SGF for planning, training, and exercises, disaster response, and recovery activities to compensate Kansas Division of Emergency Management for federal grant reductions in '26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. KDOC 25, item 1, reappropriations lapse, evidence-based programs, add funding to restore reappropriations for the evidence-based juvenile programs fund in '25. The House added $28.2 million. The Senate added $38.2 million. Item 2, reappropriations lapse, juvenile substance abuse treatment, add $2.5 million SGF to restore reappropriations for regional inpatient substance abuse treatment. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Reappropriations lapse, purchase of services, add $907,000 SGF to restore reappropriations for purchase of services. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Reappropriations lapse, capital improvements, add $536,000 SGF to restore reappropriations for priority capital improvement projects in '25. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. 26, JAG-K funding increase. Add language to increase the expenditure limitation for the JAG-K program by $2 million SGF from the Evidence-Based Juvenile Programs Fund for '26. The House added the language. The Senate did not recommend adding the language. El Dorado Correctional Facility, 25, reappropriations lapse. Add $382,944 SGF to restore reappropriations for facility operations in '25. The House did not recommend adding the funding. The Senate added the funding. Highway Patrol, 25, life safety maintenance at Salina Training Academy. Add funding for one-time urgent repairs to the Salina Training Academy in '25. House, add $1 million, all from ARPA interest. Senate, add $1 million, all from the State Highway Fund.
Moving on to page 20 for fiscal year '26, both House and Senate added funding for a hangar at Jabbar Airport for fiscal year '26. The House added $7 million, all from ARPA interest, whereas the Senate added $250,000, all from the State Highway Fund, as well as language authorizing the lease of a build-to-suit hangar facility. Item number 2 is the Troop C HQ and Central Dispatch. The Senate recommended adding $55.5 million from the State Highway Fund for the relocation of Troop C headquarters and Central Dispatch facilities, as well as to authorize a memorandum of understanding for an expansion of shared firing range facility for fiscal year '26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. Moving on to Hutchinson Correctional Facility for fiscal year '25. Number 1 is the reappropriation lapse. The Senate recommended adding about $581,000 from the SGF to restore reappropriations for facility operations. The House did not recommend adding the funding. KBI 26, item 1. The House recommended adding $500,000, all from ARPA interest, for lab infrastructure for the Forensic Science Lab for fiscal year '26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 2 is the offender registration compliance item. The House recommended adding $500,000, all from ARPA interest, for the state's SORT system with new compliance software for fiscal year '26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 3, cold case DNA. The Senate recommended adding $500,000 SGF for forensic genetic genealogy DNA analysis for solving cold cases and identifying human remains. The House did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 4 relates to the KBI HQ. The Senate recommended adding language authorizing the agency to issue of up to $100 million in bonds for new KBI headquarters and the purchase of land if necessary for fiscal year '26. The Senate also recommended adding language stating that any ARPA state relief fund monies not expended for their initially directed project will be redirected as a down payment before bond issuance or as initial principal payments for the issued bonds for this headquarters. The House did not recommend adding the language. Sentencing Commission for item 1 under 25, the reappropriation lapse. The Senate recommended adding $1.3 million from the SGF to partially restore reappropriations for the substance abuse treatment program for fiscal year '25.
On page 21 for Winfield Correctional Facility, the Senate recommended adding $83,000 SGF to restore reappropriations for facility operations in fiscal year '25. The House did not recommend adding this funding. For the Department of Agriculture in fiscal year '26, The Senate recommended deleting $900,000 SGF for the local farm-to-food program. The House did not recommend deleting this funding. The Senate recommended deleting $50,000 SGF for the Animal Facilities Inspection Program, emergency animal shelters for fiscal year '26. The House did not recommend deleting this funding. There was a recommendation to add state water plan funding for water resources cost share for fiscal year '26. The House recommended adding 4.8 million SWPF for fiscal year '26 and language providing that 750,000 of that will go for livestock production facilities to improve water efficiency and 500,000 for irrigation conservation efficiency programs. The Senate recommended adding 4 million also from the State Water Plan Fund, including $500,000 for livestock production facilities to improve water efficiency for fiscal year '26. There is a recommendation to add State Water Plan funding for Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. In fiscal year '26, the House recommended adding 1.5 million, and the Senate recommended adding 54,000. There is a recommendation to add State Water Plan for watershed dam construction for fiscal year '26. The House recommended adding 3.6 million, and the Senate recommended adding 3 million. The Senate recommended deleting 1.1 million EDIF for agriculture marketing. The House did not recommend deleting that funding. The House recommended adding 3 million, all from ARPA interest, to acquire technology and necessary approvals to operate and maintain BVLOS operations for agriculture-focused FAA-approved UAS test range for fiscal year '26. They also recommended adding language directing working with Kansas congressional delegation for federal funds for fiscal year '26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. There was a recommendation to add language deleting 350,000 SGF for the meat and poultry program for fiscal year '26. The House recommended adding language deleting funding if a federal farm bill passes to provide future funding for fiscal year '26. The Senate recommends adding language deleting funding if federal cooperative funding provided by the Food Safety and Inspection Service of the United States Department of Agriculture is equal to or greater than the state funding for the program for fiscal year '26.
Moving to page 22. Department of Wildlife and Parks, 26. 1, EDIF Parks Operations. Adjust EDIF appropriations for park operations for '26. House is $200,000. The Senate is negative $200,000. EDIF operating expenditures. Adjust EDIF appropriations for operating expenditures for '26. The House added $150,000. The Senate deleted $1.8 million. EDIF National Guard and Veterans Licenses. Delete $124,000 EDIF for National Guard and Veterans Licenses. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. The Senate deleted the funding. Cheney Lake Marina. Add $200,000 all from ARPA interest for the Cheney Lake Marina and add language to transfer the funds to the Department of Wildlife and Parks for '26. House did not recommend adding the funding or the language. The Senate added the funding and the language. Health and Environment, 25 FTE positions. Add 8.1 FTE positions. House, add the FTE positions. Senate did not recommend adding the FTE positions. 26, State Water Plan Fund, Watershed Restoration and Protection Plan, add SWPF for Watershed Restoration and Protection Plan for '26. The House added 1.5 million, the Senate added 1 million. State Water Plan Fund, LEP, Local Environmental Protection Program, add SWPF for LEP. The House added 1.2 million, the Senate added 650,000. FTE positions, add 8.1 FTE positions for '26. The House added the FTE positions, the Senate did not. Item 4, KEAMS Database Implementation Proviso, add language directing the agency to report to the State Finance Council regarding the improvements made to the TANKS program usability prior to funding being released for the KEAMS database implementation for '26. The House did not recommend adding the language. The Senate added the language.
Moving on to page 23, Kansas State Fair, fiscal year '25, item 1, Emergency Command Center. The Senate recommended adding language directing the State Fair to submit a report to the Senate Committee on Agricultural and Natural Resources and the House Committee on Agricultural and Natural Resources budget during the 26th legislative session on securing $750,000 in non-state monies for the construction of an emergency command center in '25. The House did not recommend adding the language. for fiscal year 26, the Expo Center rehabilitation, the Senate recommended adding about $365,000 from the general fund to pay off debt service obligations for the Expo Center rehabilitation, and language directing the agency to make such payment only if the debt is deemed callable for 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding or the language. Item number 2, State Fair operating expenditures. The Senate recommended deleting $135,000 SGF from the State Fair operating expenditures account for 26. The House did not recommend deleting the funding. Item number 3, the Emergency Command Center. The House recommended adding $750,000, all from ARPA interest, for an Emergency Command Center for fiscal year 26. The Senate did not recommend adding the funding. For the Water Office in 26, item number 1, the Water Plan Fund, John Redmond Reservoir Hydrosuction Pilot Program. The Senate recommended adding $3 million from the Water Plan for the project in 26. The House did not recommend adding the funding. Item number 2, Water Plan Fund, Water Planning and Project Development. Both House and Senate added funding from the water plan for water planning and project development in 26. The House added $3.5 million, whereas the Senate added $1 million. Item number 3 is assessment and evaluation. Both House and Senate added funding from the water plan fund for assessment and evaluation in 26. The House added about $2 million, whereas the Senate added a little over $1.2 million. Item number 4, independent program evaluation. Both House and Senate added funding from the Water Plan Fund for independent program evaluation for 26. The House added about $610,000, whereas the Senate added $360,000. Item number 5, Water Plan Fund transfers. Both House and Senate adjusted transfers to the Water Projects Grant Fund for 26. The House transfers an additional $1 million, whereas the Senate reduces the transfer by about $500,000.
Number 6, for the State Water Office on page 24, the Senate recommended deleting $2 million EDIF transfer to the State Water Plan Fund for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend deleting that transfer. Under statewide adjustments for fiscal year 25, the Senate recommended adding language to suspend budget stabilization fund transfers for fiscal year 25, invest 50% of the fund balance with CAPERS, and begin transferring any interest accrued in the fund to the SGF once the fund balance reaches $1.75 billion in fiscal year 25. The House did not recommend adding this language. In fiscal year 26, there is a recommendation to delete SGF to lapse a percentage of state operations funded from the SGF for fiscal year 26. The following expenditures are excluded from this adjustment: capital improvements, debt service principal and interest, state aid, and other assistance. The House recommended deleting $34.5 million SGF to lapse 1.5% of state operations funded with SGF. The Senate recommended deleting $69.6 million SGF to lapse 3% of the state operations funded from the SGF. The Senate recommended adding language directing all executive branch agencies except the Attorney General, Insurance Department, Secretary of State, State Treasurer, Legislative Branch, and the Judicial Branch to require full-time employees to perform their duties in their assigned state office, facility, or field location except during authorized travel for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding this language. The Senate recommended adding budget stabilization fund adjustment language that would invest 50% of the fund balance with CAPERS and transfer accrued interest once the fund balance reaches $1.75 billion for fiscal year 26. The House did not recommend adding this language. There is a recommendation from both the House and Senate to delete funding for vacant positions in fiscal year 26. The House recommended deleting $11.1 million SGF to eliminate funding for vacant positions. Adjustments would be subject to certification by the State Finance Council before being applied. Furthermore, the following agencies would be excluded: state hospitals and correctional facilities. The Senate recommended adding language to lapse funding associated with the salaries and wages of vacant positions at the end of the fiscal year for rather than at the beginning of the fiscal year. In fiscal year 27, for other statewide adjustments, there was the language added to invest 50% of the fund balance with CAPERS for the Budget Stabilization Fund and begin transferring that fund, the interest accrued, once the balance reaches $1.75 billion. The House did not recommend adding this language.
Page 25, last page. State employee pay. FY26, the House plan is add $91.8 million, including $38.1 million SGF, Employees that are under market by 10% or more would receive either an increase to bring salaries to 10% under market pay or a 2.5% increase, whichever is greater. Employees that are under market by less than 10% and employees that are over market by 10% or less would receive a 2.5% increase if classified. Classified employees that are over market by more than 10% would receive a 1% increase. Classified employees not reflected in the market survey would receive a 2.5% increase. All unclassified employees with job classifications that are not included in the market survey will be compensated via a merit pool. All executive branch agencies, legislative branch agencies, judicial branch agencies, and state board of regents and the university shall receive a sum equivalent to the total of 2.5%, rounded to the nearest penny, of the salaries of all benefits eligible unclassified employees in such agency to be distributed as a merit pool. The following employees are excluded from all provisions of this adjustment: judges and justices, statewide elected officials, legislators, teachers and licensed personnel of the Kansas State Schools for the Deaf and Blind, part-time non-benefits eligible employees, and employees on a formal written career progression plan that are not otherwise named in these adjustments. The Senate position adds $90.2 million, including $36.7 million SGF, but does not include the language to provide a 1% increase to employees that are over market by more than 10%. The other adjustment to the state employee pay plan is a deletion of $382,996 of EDIF to remove appropriations for the state employee pay plan made by the Senate. The House did not do this. Last item, State Finance Council FY26 DEI elimination. Add $4 million SGF and delete $4 million from the Office of the Governor and the Department of Administration. That's $2 million each. Just to clarify that, and add language authorizing the State Finance Council to transfer $2 million SGF to the Office of the Governor and $2 million SGF to the Department of Administration upon receipt by the State Finance Council of a certification that all state agencies have eliminated DEI positions, eliminated DEI mandates, policies, programs, preferences, and activities, eliminated DEI training requirements, eliminated state grants or contracts related to DEI, and removed gender-identifying pronouns from email signature blocks for FY26. The House did not consider adjusting the funding or the language. The Senate adjusted the funding and the language. And I would take this moment, as I'm going here, to let you know that we are passing out the State Water Plan Fund and EDIF adjustments for 26 because they're just a little easier to see on one table as opposed to spread throughout this conference list. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dylan. I think we'll open up for questions. I wanted to go back to page 8, and maybe this is a question for you, Dylan, or maybe the senators can answer this. In the Department of Labor for fiscal year 2026, the employment security law update, is that in respect to General Motors? Okay, good. We've had discussion in the House side about potential layoffs with General Motors, and I didn't know if that was referencing, because it says collective bargaining, so and going back to floor amendments, obviously you know our position. We're going to go back and look at all the floor amendments that were made on the Senate side, and if the maker of the amendment didn't vote for the budget, it's probably not going to stick, just to make that, Then there was one item that I wanted to ask in regards to higher ed reappropriation. I know this was brought up to our attention after we had Senate Bill 125 pass out. And that was in regards to reappropriations with universities, and namely with these, I believe, $75 million for the University of Kansas Cancer Center. Is that what that language was referencing to? I can't find my notes right now, but
I can look up that page, but Brianna, that's what it's referring to, is when it talks about the general reappropriation number.
I just want to make sure that that was taken care of, because that was not the intent. We would want that cancer center to move forward, so I just wanted to make sure that was correct. I believe that's, and all the bonding authority for University of Kansas, Kansas State University, and Wichita State University is going to show up in 26 and 27. Authorizing the bonding.
2 years.
So the University of Kansas does for the same items. Wichita State University does for the same items. K-State. K-State only shows up in 2026. Okay, I just wanted to have that clarification. House, any other questions?
One.
Representative Ballard.
Page 3, I'm looking at your strong military bases. Was there some reason why, I mean, we have 35,000, why you went 250,000?
I think I can answer that. I think the original was around 250,000. We reduced it by 350,000. They reduced the entire item down to zero.
Okay.
And you'll see that with EDIF. That's something that we're going to have to work out with conference committee, because I believe you had 4 items in EDIF, 4 or 5. And so, and obviously we had the entire table, so that's something we're going to have to negotiate. But that's going to be a discrepancy that you will show.
Okay, and that's why I'm asking, because it is a discrepancy and it's hard to kind of follow. Okay, thank you.
Any further questions? I'm not seeing on our side. The only other thing that I would say in regards to just clarity, because you'll see we've had basically 2 budget bills. One was 2007 that we passed before turnaround, and then we had Senate Bill 125 that came over from you, which was the claims against the state bill. And so for clarity in regards to this, because I know there are some items that it says this item included in Senate Bill 125, and then it says the Senate added the language. But I think there were some items that differ. And so for, like I said, for clarity purposes, I would like us to move the items in 2007 into Senate Bill 125 as passed out of the House, so we can have those side-by-sides done to see what the discrepancy is with Senate Bill 125 as opposed to what was done in 2007, if that's okay. Dylan. Oh, Senator Petty.
So what you're recommending is we won't be seeing then House Bill 125. We'll be seeing there's just everything is now in 2007. Would that be correct?
No, it's going to be showing up in Senate Bill 125. All the contents of 207 are going to roll into Senate Bill 125. But that way we can clean up some of these items. And then I know there were some items that we had in 125 that differed from yours, but here it doesn't reflect that. So if we merge the 2 bills together, it will reflect the differences with new side-by-sides. Okay, Dylan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for now, just to let you know, this salmon sheet, these are the items that are in SB 125 that do not appear on the conference comparison list. So it's only in those situations in which it was in 2007, but was not in the Senate position effectively. So those items are on here. I understand that you will be integrating these into this, but I wanted to give them to you ahead of time.
Senator Billinger, Chairman.
I think we're good with moving to 125.
Okay. Is there anything else? Okay. I think we'll get together, Chairman, on a time, because I know we're both chambers are on the floor all day today, probably going to be running pretty late. And then I know that, you know, with the passing of your mother, you have obligations back home tomorrow. So it would be Monday before we would conference again, but we'll get together and then set up a time and place.
Sounds good.
All right. All right. We are adjourned.